June 1864. The air over the James River hung heavy with heat and the smell of pine tar. In the darkness along the Virginia shore, hundreds of Union engineers worked by touch and whisper. Every sound was muffled. Hammers wrapped in rags, boots padded with cloth. The river itself seemed to be holding its breath. Out in the current, pontoon boats, 31 feet long and slick with sweat and mud, were being pushed into place one by one, each guided by men waist-deep in black water. Above them, on the bluffs of Weyanoke Point, mule teams waited with timbers, balks, and planks, stacked like bones for a giant yet to rise. By dawn, the first light of morning revealed the impossible. A bridge stretching more than 2,000 feet across one of the broadest rivers in the South, the longest floating bridge ever built in the history of warfare. In silence and darkness, a single night had produced a miracle of wood, iron, and discipline. To the Confederate scouts north of the Chickahominy, nothing seemed to have changed. Campfires still burned. Union pickets still manned their trenches. From all appearances, General Grant's army was locked in the same bloody stalemate that had defined the Overland Campaign since May. Yet at that very moment, over 100,000 men, 5,000 wagons, and 60 artillery batteries were preparing to cross the James, vanishing into the southern countryside toward Petersburg, the supply heart of the Confederacy. It was one of the most audacious maneuvers in American military history. An entire army ferried across a river wider than the Thames, under the eyes of the enemy, and unseen. The crossing of the James did not depend on luck or daring alone. It was the product of something far greater, a new kind of warfare built on calculation, organization, and industrial power. That night, beneath the Virginia moon, the war shifted. The age of heroics gave way to the age of logistics, and the men who built that bridge, carpenters, blacksmiths, and soldiers with calloused hands, quietly proved that the Union's greatest weapon was not its rifles or cannons, but its capacity to build faster, farther, and in silence. By early June 1864, the war in Virginia had become a slaughterhouse without movement. Grant's Overland Campaign, a relentless grinding push from the Rapidan toward Richmond, had promised to end the war through sheer momentum. But momentum had met mud, trenches, and a commander named Robert E. Lee. Every mile south had been bought with thousands of lives. The math was appalling. From the Wilderness to Cold Harbor, more than 50,000 Union soldiers had fallen in just over a month. Lee's smaller army had lost half that, yet held firm. Cold Harbor was the breaking point. On June 3rd, Grant's men advanced across open fields into entrenched Confederate lines and were annihilated in minutes. Veterans pinned their names to their coats before the attack, so their bodies could be identified later. When the smoke cleared, Union dead carpeted the earth in front of Lee's position. The campaign's promise of decisive victory had curdled into despair. Even Grant, the general who never admitted defeat, wrote in his official report, "I have always regretted that the last assault was ever made." But Grant was not the kind of commander who retreated. If the enemy could not be crushed head-on, he would be outmaneuvered. What Grant saw, where others saw futility, was opportunity. The Confederates expected another frontal assault. They were fixed, watching, waiting for more blood. Lee's army, though smaller, possessed one priceless advantage: interior lines. With shorter routes and better intelligence, Lee could shift troops faster than Grant could move his vast army. To beat him, Grant would need to move faster still, and vanish while doing it. The idea that emerged in the days after Cold Harbor was almost suicidal in its ambition. Grant's staff officers proposed crossing the James River, a tidal giant over a mile wide in places, 84 feet deep at its center, and flowing through enemy territory. If successful, the Union Army could strike south toward Petersburg, the logistical artery feeding Richmond. But to attempt it meant splitting the army in two. Half would be on one bank, half on the other, with the Confederates close enough to destroy both. 1 hour of discovery could mean annihilation. It was an operation that would hinge on two elements Grant trusted more than luck: secrecy and engineering. The Union's Engineer Corps had become a precision instrument by 1864. They had thrown pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock, the Chickahominy, and countless swamps in Virginia. But none had faced a river like the James. The challenge wasn't just its width, it was its tide. The James could rise and fall 6 feet in a single night, strong enough to snap rope lashings or twist pontoons out of alignment. To cross it would require the longest floating bridge ever built, over 2,100 feet, and it would need to be done in one night. Grant didn't hesitate. "We'll cross the James," he said simply. To his generals, it sounded like madness. To his engineers, it was a summons. In the camps along the Chickahominy, soldiers still nursed their wounds from Cold Harbor. The ground was a graveyard of blue and gray uniforms. The heat was unbearable. The stench of unburied dead lingered. Men expected another hopeless attack at dawn. Instead, couriers whispered new orders: prepare to march south, silently. Entire divisions would move under cover of darkness. Supply wagons were to follow alternate routes. Pontoon trains, loaded with timber, canvas boats, and iron fittings, would slip away toward the river. The plan was audacious, but it reflected something deeper in Grant's leadership: a new kind of thinking about war. He had learned that courage alone could not conquer entrenchments. It would take calculation, the synchronization of industry, manpower, and speed. This was no longer the romantic war of charges and drums. This was a machine war, one where steel, steam, and human will worked as gears in a single mechanism. By the second week of June, Lee still believed the Union Army was preparing to attack. His scouts reported heavy entrenchments and campfires glowing through the night. They didn't realize those fires were tended by empty lines. The Union Army was vanishing beneath their gaze. Behind the front, the pontoon trains rumbled through the night, each wagon creaking under tons of timber and canvas. Engineers inspected their gear: lashings, balks, chest planks, and anchors. Every component had to be accounted for. Every detail had to align. Because once the order came, there would be no room for error. No second chance on a river that deep, that wide, and that decisive. From the ashes of Cold Harbor's futility, a new kind of warfare was taking shape. Not of charge and countercharge, but of movement and precision. Grant had found his weapon: silence. And in that silence, the engineers were already preparing to perform a miracle. The United States Army that marched south in June 1864 was more than an army. It was a moving civilization. Behind the muskets and bayonets stood a machine of industrial strength the world had never seen in war before. The North's power did not lie solely in its population or factories, but in its ability to organize those resources into motion, to turn carpenters, blacksmiths, and surveyors into the backbone of modern warfare. Nowhere was that transformation more visible than in the U.S. Engineer Corps. What began the war as a small cadre of bridge builders and draftsmen had, by 1864, evolved into one of the most disciplined and technically skilled forces on Earth. They were soldiers, yes, but their weapons were hammers, augers, and lashings, and they carried with them the power to move an army where no army had any right to go. A typical pontoon bridge train in the Army of the Potomac looked more like a traveling factory than a military unit. Each wagon carried a 31-foot pontoon boat made of white pine, curved and reinforced with iron bands. These weighed over 2,000 pounds apiece and were lashed to mules that strained under the burden. Other wagons hauled balks, heavy beams used as the bridge's ribs, and stacks of chest planks to form the roadbed. The engineers could build or dismantle a 200-foot bridge in less than 2 hours. Every piece was standardized, numbered, and interchangeable. For the James River operation, General Henry W. Benham, the chief of the Engineer Brigade, assembled more than 100 pontoons and 450,000 feet of timber. Some were canvas boats, collapsible and light, designed for rapid transport. These innovations reflected a hard truth Grant's army had learned. Success now depended not on bravery, but on logistics. Every plank, every rope, every nail had to arrive in the right place, at the right time. The bridge was not just a structure, it was the embodiment of industrial order. The scope of the logistical apparatus behind the engineers was staggering. From Washington's depots came a steady flow of raw materials: iron fittings forged in Pittsburgh, hemp rope spun in New York, and canvas treated with linseed oil in Philadelphia. These moved by rail to Fredericksburg, then by wagon south toward the front. The Army's supply network stretched more than 200 miles, operated by 60,000 mules and 4,000 wagons. The movement of this machinery was a symphony of organization, guided by telegraph dispatches and quartermaster ledgers. In a sense, the pontoon bridge was the North's industrial heart made visible, a floating factory floor laid over the river. Each man on the engineer detail knew his place in the sequence. One group launching boats, another securing them with anchors and lashings, another laying balks and planks across the line. They moved with mechanical rhythm, as if time itself had been divided into production units. This precision was no accident. By mid-war, the Union had learned to institutionalize efficiency. Engineers trained on the Rappahannock and Potomac under combat conditions, turning field improvisation into reproducible method. A bridge that once took days to construct could now be completed in hours. The result was a kind of Marshall assembly line, a concept entirely foreign to Confederate forces, still reliant on local improvisation and manual labor. General Benham's reports from June 1864 read more like an industrial ledger than a battlefield diary. He recorded measurements down to the inch, weight loads by the ton, and current speeds by the knot. Every factor mattered because this bridge, unlike any before it, would have to bear the weight of an entire army. Infantry, artillery, supply wagons, and ambulances would all roll across its floating spine. A single weak joint could undo the entire campaign. The genius of the operation wasn't in brute strength, it was in the choreography. Grant's headquarters coordinated the engineers' work with the movement of 4 separate Army corps. More than 100,000 men who would have to arrive in sequence, cross without delay, and reform on the far side ready to fight. The crossing would consume over 24 hours, and yet the Confederates could not be alerted at any point. In that sense, the James River Bridge was as much an act of faith as it was of engineering. Faith in mathematics, in timing, in the capacity of ordinary men to perform extraordinary labor when guided by discipline. The engineers were not heroes in the romantic sense. They didn't storm ramparts or wave flags, but their work was a different kind of courage. The courage of precision, patience, and responsibility. A missed bolt or misplaced anchor could doom 100,000 men. By June 13th, as the last of the pontoon wagons rolled toward Weyanoke Point, the scale of the task came into focus. The James stretched before them, a mile of brown water, tidal and deep, its far bank hidden by mist. To the Confederate scouts, it was an impassable barrier. To the engineers, it was merely a problem to be solved. The night ahead would test not only their tools and their training, but the very idea of industrial warfare itself. The bridge they were about to build was more than a path across a river. It was the physical proof that the Union could manufacture victory, plank by plank, calculation by calculation, until the war itself was swallowed by machinery. On the evening of June 12, 1864, the Union Army began to vanish. Not in an instant, not with fanfare, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a machine winding itself into motion. Campfires burned on the lines north of the Chickahominy River, smoke curling lazily into the humid Virginia night. To Confederate lookouts, it appeared as it always had, the same shimmering haze above the same blue entrenchments. But below that illusion, the greatest logistical sleight of hand of the Civil War was already unfolding. Grant's plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its precision. His army, more than 100,000 men, 5,000 wagons, and 60 batteries of artillery, would slip away under cover of darkness, march 40 miles south, and cross the James River before Robert E. Lee even realized they were gone. Secrecy was everything. One misplaced bugle call, one gunshot in the dark, and the entire operation would unravel. The army would be caught mid-march, divided by rivers, and destroyed in detail. At 9 p.m., the orders went out. Tents were left standing, fires tended by skeleton crews, and empty rations scattered to give the illusion of normalcy. Infantry columns began moving out in silence, boots wrapped in burlap to muffle their steps, wagon wheels padded with canvas strips. The roads filled with an endless procession of men and mules, artillery limbers creaking under the weight of bronze and iron. Along the route, engineers had already scouted the fords and built temporary bridges over smaller streams, preparing the path like stagehands before a performance. The night air was thick, the sound of the movement eerily subdued. Soldiers were forbidden to speak above a whisper. Even the mules seemed to sense the gravity of what was happening, their braying stifled by handlers tugging quietly at reins. One soldier later recalled, "It was as if the whole army held its breath." By dawn, the first columns had passed out of sight, winding south toward the hamlet of Charles City Courthouse. Grant rode with them for part of the night, inspecting the progress. He knew the danger. Lee's scouts were expert riders who could appear anywhere, and the terrain between the Chickahominy and the James was a web of narrow roads and swampy lowland. Any delay could bring disaster, but for once, luck seemed to favor him. The Confederate army remained fixed in its entrenchments, convinced Grant was preparing another assault. From the Confederate lines, the flicker of Union campfires appeared unchanged. Scouts reported minor skirmishes and routine patrols. Lee, trusting his intuition, concluded that Grant was simply regrouping for another frontal attack. That single misjudgment gave Grant the one thing he had never been granted before: time. Behind the moving columns came the engineers. Their pontoon trains crept along the muddy roads like serpents of iron and wood. Each wagon carried a section of the bridge to come. 31-foot boats, timber balks, bundles of chess planks, iron fittings, and coiled ropes. The convoy stretched for miles. Every wheel, every chain, every hoofbeat was part of an unbroken pattern of movement. It was a triumph not just of planning, but of restraint. On June 13th, as the army reached the river's edge near Weyanoke Point, the scale of the gamble became clear. The James River sprawled before them, a brown tidal expanse nearly a mile wide. Its far bank rose steeply into the tree line, obscured by morning mist. Across that river lay the road to Petersburg, the Confederacy's industrial heart, the rail hub that kept Lee's army alive. To reach it, undetected, meant changing the geometry of the entire war. Grant's orders were precise. The infantry would halt and bivouac out of sight while the engineers began their work at nightfall. The cavalry, already ferried across by steamer, would screen the far bank. The remaining corps would follow in timed intervals once the bridge was complete. Grant's staff officers, their maps spread across a wagon table, checked every coordinate, every timetable, every corps alignment. This was not improvisation. It was choreography on a continental scale. And still, no word came from Lee. His cavalry was probing in the wrong direction, searching north and east for movements that no longer existed. The Union Army had become a ghost, its trenches occupied only by decoy troops and smoldering fires. When Confederate scouts finally ventured forward, They found the camps nearly empty, cooking pots still warm, a few stray soldiers left behind to give the illusion of routine. It was the perfect deception. The Army of the Potomac had melted from sight, like fog under the sun. When the Confederate signalmen finally realized what was happening, the Union Army was already beyond their reach, and the engineers were about to do something that would make that disappearance permanent. That night, while Lee's couriers galloped through the darkness searching for answers, the engineers began to unload their pontoons. Their orders were clear: build the bridge, make no sound, and finish before dawn. The fate of the entire campaign, and perhaps the war itself, now rested not in the hands of soldiers, but of builders. Night fell over the James River like a curtain. The air was thick and still, heavy with humidity and anticipation. Torches flickered low against the black water as hundreds of Union engineers began one of the most audacious acts of construction in military history. Their orders were simple and absolute. Build a bridge across the James, 2,100 feet of floating roadway, before dawn. No shouting, no lanterns, no second chances. The first pontoons arrived at the riverbank around midnight on June 14, 1864. Each was a 31-foot wooden boat, hauled overland by mule teams and lowered into the current by hand. The engineers, stripped to their shirts and soaked with sweat, guided them into place by the faint glow of covered lamps. The river was wide, nearly a mile across here, and the tide moved like a living thing, 6 feet of rise and fall between dusk and dawn. A single misjudged anchor or slack rope could tear the entire bridge apart. They began by setting anchor lines from both banks. Heavy stones, wrapped in rope and iron rings, were dropped into the dark current to hold each pontoon in place. Men worked waist-deep in the river, driving stakes, tightening lashings, and fitting the balks, the heavy beams that would form the bridge's skeleton. Each pontoon had to be positioned precisely, bow to stern, 30 inches apart. Above them, officers whispered measurements, adjusting spacing by inches in the dim light. There was no sound but the soft slap of water and the muffled creak of timber. To the men working knee-deep in the current, it felt less like battle and more like ritual, a grim kind of craftsmanship performed in silence. They couldn't see the opposite bank, only the faint shimmer of moonlight on water and the glow of other torches somewhere far ahead. The bridge seemed to be growing out of the darkness itself. By 2 a.m., the first 100 feet were in place. The engineers moved with a precision born of repetition, each man knowing exactly where to step, when to lift, when to tighten. The balks were laid across the pontoons like ribs, then covered with chess planks to create a roadbed just wide enough for 2 wagons to pass. The smell of wet wood and tar filled the air. Men tied off each section with rawhide lashings that squeaked and tightened under the pull of the current. As the tide rose, the challenge deepened. The current grew stronger, threatening to twist the anchored pontoons out of line. Engineers threw additional anchors, some weighing over 50 pounds, to steady the bridge. At one point, a pontoon broke free, drifting downstream until a squad of men dove after it, hauling it back by hand. Another crew worked waist-deep to reposition a beam that had split under tension. Still, the bridge lengthened, foot by foot, into the river's heart. By 3 a.m., the moon slipped behind a cloud, plunging the river into near-total darkness. The men continued by touch alone, their muscles trembling from fatigue. They had been awake for 30 hours, building without pause. Sweat dripped from their faces into the water as they hammered, pulled, and lashed with mechanical focus. Each plank that locked into place brought them closer to the opposite shore, and closer to the moment the entire operation would be revealed by dawn. Then, at 4:30 a.m., a faint line of gray appeared on the eastern horizon. The engineers moved faster, doubling their pace. When the first rays of sunlight broke over the treetops, the impossible stood complete. A continuous bridge, of 101 pontoons stretching 2,100 feet from shore to shore. It gleamed faintly in the dawn light, a silver spine lying atop the water, solid and silent. One officer later wrote that it was the most beautiful sight I ever beheld, a thing of perfect form and purpose. Another, less poetic, simply recorded the numbers: 3,200 man-hours, 450,000 feet of timber, 30 anchors, completed in 7 hours. They had done it. The men sat where they stood, exhausted, their uniforms soaked through. Some dipped canteens into the river. Others just stared in disbelief. Behind them, the rumble of approaching wagons grew louder. The first columns of infantry were already forming on the road, waiting for the order to cross. Downstream, Confederate pickets still watched the wrong riverbank. They had no idea what was coming. In less than a night, the engineers had turned the James, that great natural barrier protecting Richmond, into a highway. They had made the impossible routine, and in doing so, redefined what war could be. This was no mere feat of construction. It was a revelation, proof that the Union's greatest strength was not in its generals or its guns, but in its ability to build, to organize, and to endure. As the first soldiers set foot on the planks, the bridge creaked but held firm. Sunlight caught on the water as the tide began to turn. The river, once a symbol of separation, now carried an army across its back. Silent, efficient, unstoppable. Dawn on June 15, 1864, broke soft and golden over the James River. Mist hovered above the water, rising in slow curls as the first rays touched the floating planks. The bridge the engineers had finished only hours before now stretched across the broad river like a ribbon of pale wood, narrow, perfect, and impossibly still. On the north bank, 100,000 Union soldiers waited in silence, their blue ranks snaking through the woods and down toward the water's edge. The order came just after sunrise. Begin the crossing. The cavalry went first. Their horses snorted at the strange sensation beneath their hooves. The bridge swayed gently, rolling with the tide. But the men urged them forward. The sound of iron shoes on wet planks echoed softly over the river. Behind them came the infantry, moving in columns of 4, rifles slung across their shoulders, boots thudding in steady rhythm. The bridge trembled but held firm, buoyed by the 101 pontoons anchored in place. The crossing was a study in precision. Each regiment was assigned a specific time and interval. Officers marched at the head of their companies, keeping perfect alignment to prevent crowding. Cannon wheels were wrapped in burlap to muffle noise. Wagon axles were greased to prevent squeaks. The engineers stood by the rails with poles, steadying the pontoons as the weight of men and horses shifted across. The air was thick with heat and the faint scent of tar and river mud. From the opposite shore, the spectacle must have seemed like a miracle. An army walking across the water. The bridge flexed gently with the current, the sunlight flashing off the rifles of the men as they moved. One private, gazing down into the river below, later wrote, "It was as though the James itself had chosen to bear us." The movement never stopped. All day and into the night, the endless line of men and wagons rolled southward. First came the Second Corps, then the Sixth, then the immense trains of supplies that fed the army's march. By afternoon, artillery batteries clattered onto the bridge, heavy Parrott rifles and Napoleons, each weighing more than a ton. The bridge dipped under their mass, but held steady, the pontoons flexing like muscle beneath skin. Grant watched from the north bank for part of the morning, silent and satisfied. For weeks he had been searching for a way to move his army faster than Lee could respond, and here it was, a river turned into a road. Beside him, Chief Engineer Henry Benham took notes, adjusting tension ropes and ballast weights as the tide changed. Every plank, every anchor, every bolt had to work perfectly. Failure at any point could have been catastrophic. One broken section and thousands of men, horses, and wagons would be swept away by the current. But the bridge held. It became a living artery, one that pulsed with the movement of an entire army. By midday, the James shimmered beneath a haze of dust, kicked up by marching feet. From a distance, Confederate observers still believed Grant's army remained north of the river. They saw the smoke of burning camps and assumed another assault was brewing near the Chickahominy. No one yet grasped that the Union Army was already gone. As night fell, the final waves of soldiers crossed under starlight. Lanterns, shielded to hide their glow, flickered faintly along the banks. Engineers remained at their posts through the night, tightening lines as the tide reversed, bailing out water from the pontoons, repairing planks worn smooth by tens of thousands of boots. By the early hours of June 16th, the last wagon rolled onto the south shore, the crossing complete. In 24 hours, the Army of the Potomac, 100,000 men, 5,000 wagons, 60 batteries of artillery, and 3,000 head of cattle, had crossed a river wider than the Thames. No comparable operation had ever been achieved in modern warfare. Not a single boat was lost. Not a single Confederate gun fired in opposition. The entire movement had been executed without Lee's knowledge. When the first light of dawn touched the southern bank, Grant's army was already advancing toward Petersburg. Only then did Confederate scouts realize the truth. Lee's headquarters erupted with urgency. Couriers rode through the night to warn his generals, but it was too late. The Union Army was south of the James, entrenched, supplied, and ready to strike. Behind them, the bridge still floated serenely, a silent witness to the feat that had just taken place. The engineers, exhausted but proud, stood on the banks and watched the tide lap at their work. One officer later wrote that it felt as though the river itself had been conquered, not by gunfire, but by calculation. It was more than a crossing. It was proof that war had changed, that planning, precision, and endurance could achieve what courage alone never could. The James River Bridge had made the impossible look ordinary, and as the army disappeared into the Virginia hills beyond, the Confederacy's final defenses began to crumble, not with a charge, but with the steady rhythm of men marching across a bridge that should never have existed. By the morning of June 17, 1864, the James River was calm again. The tide had shifted, carrying away the debris and sawdust left by the engineers. The great pontoon bridge, 2,100 feet of timber, iron, and ingenuity, still gleamed in the sunlight, its surface worn smooth by the passage of 100,000 men. On the far bank, the last wagons rattled toward Petersburg, their wheels sinking into the Virginia clay. The impossible had been accomplished. When news of the crossing finally reached Confederate headquarters, disbelief turned to alarm. For days, Lee had been certain Grant was preparing another frontal assault north of Richmond. By the time he realized the truth, that the entire Army of the Potomac had crossed the James, it was too late. His cavalry raced south in desperation, but they arrived to find Union pickets already in position beyond the Appomattox River. The balance of the war had shifted overnight. For the Confederacy, the crossing of the James was not just a tactical setback, it was a strategic collapse. Richmond, once shielded by natural barriers and defensive lines, was now exposed. Grant's new position south of the river meant he could strike directly at Petersburg, the city that fed the Confederate war machine. Its rail lines connected Richmond to the south, carrying food, ammunition, and reinforcements. If Petersburg fell, Richmond would wither. The war's geography had been rewritten in a single night. Grant understood exactly what this meant. He had forced Lee into a corner where maneuver was impossible. The war in Virginia would no longer be one of fluid marches and desperate gambles. It would become a siege, methodical, grinding, industrial. Petersburg would mark the beginning of a new kind of warfare, trenches stretching for miles, earthworks fortified with timber and sandbags, artillery duels that lasted for weeks. What had begun with a bridge would end in the slow strangulation of the Confederacy. Back at Weyanoke Point, the engineers dismantled the bridge with the same precision they had built it. For 8 days it had served as the artery of an army, and now it was time to move on. Each pontoon was hauled ashore, scraped clean, and loaded back onto wagons. Every rope and anchor was coiled and numbered. The bridge had done its work, silently, perfectly. In his official report, Brigadier General Henry Benham recorded the operation in language stripped of drama. Bridge completed at 4:00 a.m., June 15th. Total length, 2,100 feet. Construction time, 7 hours. Beneath those dry figures lay the most consequential engineering feat of the war. The Army of the Potomac had not won through brilliance or heroics, but through calculation, coordination, and an unbreakable chain of labor. Theirs was a victory measured not in blood, but in planks, ropes, and man-hours. Even Lee, in his dispatches, seemed to acknowledge what had changed. He no longer referred to Grant's forces as an invading army, but as a moving machine. The phrase captured the new reality. The Union was now fighting with industrial discipline, an army powered by factories, rails, and supply chains that reached from Virginia's rivers to the mills of Pennsylvania and the docks of New York. Against that, even Lee's brilliance could only delay the inevitable. The crossing of the James was, in essence, the turning point of the Overland Campaign, the moment when Union strategy transcended battlefield courage and became an expression of national will. Grant's army no longer sought to win a single battle. It sought to make victory inevitable. The James River Bridge was the physical embodiment of that philosophy, a structure that defied nature through planning, precision, and perseverance. For the engineers who built it, there were no medals, no songs, no monuments. Their names were barely recorded in the annals of command. Yet their bridge changed the trajectory of the war more profoundly than any cannonade or cavalry charge. They had demonstrated that the Union's strength lay not in the courage of individuals, but in the collective power of organization. In the decades that followed, military historians would look back on the night of June 14, 1864, as the birth of a new kind of warfare, one where the tools of industry became as decisive as the tools of combat. The James River Bridge stood for only 8 days, but its legacy endured for generations. It proved that the North's true weapon was not its army, but its ability to build. When the bridge was finally gone, the river returned to silence. The engineers marched on, their wagons creaking under the weight of timber and iron. Behind them, the James flowed on, as it always had, indifferent, eternal, yet forever marked by what had crossed it. In that brief span of 7 hours, America had crossed more than a river. It had crossed into the modern age of war, an age where precision, patience, and industry would decide the fate of nations.